The Man Who Sat Still, I. September 26, 1983. Just after midnight. A bunker south of Moscow. Concrete walls, fluorescent lights, the hum of ventilation systems, rows of consoles arranged in a semicircle, each one monitoring a different piece of the sky. Stanislav Petrov sat at his station. He was not supposed to be there. He was covering someone else's shift. A replacement. A lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, 44 years old, trained to watch screens and follow protocols. This was his job. Watch the data. Report what the system tells you. Trust the machines. The room was quiet except for the equipment, the kind of quiet that becomes its own sound after hours of sitting in it. He was tired. And then the alarm. 2. To understand what happened in that room, you have to understand what the room was for. It was called Serpukhov 15, a command center buried underground, part of a vast network designed to detect one thing: missiles, specifically American missiles. The Soviets called it the Oko system, the eye. Satellites positioned in orbit, sensors pointed at the United States, watching for the heat signature of an intercontinental ballistic missile launch. The logic was simple. If the Americans launched, the satellites would see it. The satellites would relay the information to the bunker. The bunker would relay it to Moscow. Moscow would have minutes, perhaps 10, perhaps 15, to decide whether to launch their own missiles in response. This was called deterrence, mutually assured destruction. The theory was that no one would fire first if firing first meant being destroyed in return. Both sides had enough weapons to end civilization several times over, so both sides watched constantly for the signal that the other had decided to end the world. The people in rooms like Serpukhov 15 were not strategists or politicians. They were technicians, observers. Their job was not to think. It was to report, to be the link in the chain between the machines and the decision makers, to see the data, verify it, pass it up. Petrov understood this. He'd been trained for it. But he also understood something else, something they didn't talk about in the training, that the people in these rooms, sitting at these consoles, were also the people who would set in motion the irreversible. He was not a military man by temperament. He'd studied engineering. He worked on the systems themselves, developing them, testing them, trying to understand their limitations. He knew how they worked. He knew what they could see and what they could miss. And he knew they'd been wrong before. 3rd, the alarm was not quiet. Red lights, a siren, the word launch appearing on the screen in front of him. One missile, American, detected by satellite, heading towards Soviet territory. The protocol was clear. Report it immediately. Let the command structure decide what it means. That was not his decision to make. His job was to pass the information forward, but he hesitated. One missile didn't make sense. If the Americans were going to launch a first strike, if they decided that this was the moment to try to destroy the Soviet Union before it could respond, they wouldn't send one missile. They'd send everything, hundreds, maybe thousands. An overwhelming attack designed to destroy launch sites, command centers, early warning systems, everything, before the Soviets could fire back. One missile was not a strategy. It was barely a provocation, so either the satellite was wrong or this was something else. A test that went wrong, a malfunction, a mistake. He stared at the screen. The other officers in the room were looking at him, waiting. The protocol was clear. They all knew what he was supposed to do, but he didn't reach for the phone. He told them to wait, to verify, to check again. And then the system showed a second missile. then a third, then a fourth. 5 in total. Still not enough for a first strike. Still wrong. But now the alarm was louder, the lights brighter, the pressure unbearable. 5 missiles. 5 launches detected. The system was telling him repeatedly with increasing certainty that the United States had fired nuclear weapons at the Soviet Union. He had minutes, maybe less. If he reported this, if he picked up the phone and said, "Launch detected," it would go up the chain to commanders, to generals, to the people who could authorize a counterstrike. And in the chaos, in the fear, in the handful of minutes they'd have to decide, they might believe it. They might fire back. And if they fired back, the Americans would see it. And they would fire everything. He looked at the screen. 5 missiles. The system had never been this wrong before. But it had been wrong. He knew it had been wrong. Small errors. Glitches. The Americans had passed a resolution that year condemning the Soviets for shooting down a civilian airliner. Tensions were high. Trust was non-existent. Everyone was afraid. He thought about the satellites, how they worked, how they detected heat signatures from space, how they sometimes mistook other things for missiles, sunlight reflecting off clouds, for instance. High-altitude cloud at the right angle could look, to a sensor, like the heat of a rocket exhaust. He thought about how the system was supposed to have ground-based radar to confirm, but the radar hadn't picked up anything. The radar was silent. 5 missiles on the screen. Nothing on the radar. He made a decision. He didn't report it. IV. Understand what this meant. He was not refusing to follow orders because he believed in peace. He was refusing to follow orders because he thought the data was wrong, but he didn't know. He couldn't know. Not for certain. Not in that moment. If he was wrong, if the missiles were real, then he'd just given the Americans a head start. He'd just allowed a first strike to go unreported. The Soviet leadership would have no warning, no time to respond. Millions of people would die without anyone in Moscow even knowing why. If he was right, if this was a false alarm, then he just prevented a retaliatory strike that would have killed millions of Americans for no reason, and triggered the Americans' own retaliation, killing millions more. Everyone. He didn't know which it was. He sat there, in that chair, with the alarm still going, the screen still flashing, the other officers still watching him, and he waited. He waited for something to confirm it, for the radar to show something, for the missiles to appear somewhere they should appear if they were real, for anything. The minutes stretched. Nothing happened. No radar confirmation. No secondary alerts. No impacts. The satellites continued to insist the missiles were there, but nothing else supported it. And slowly, gradually, the data started to change. The signals faded. The missiles, if they'd ever been there, disappeared. It had been a false alarm. The system had mistaken sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds for the heat signature of missile launches, a convergence of angle, timing, and sensor error. The machines had been wrong, and if Petrov had done what he was trained to do, if he'd followed the protocol, trusted the system, reported the launch, no one knows what would have happened next. Maybe someone higher up the chain would have questioned it. Maybe they would have waited for confirmation, or maybe they wouldn't have. Maybe in the fear and the chaos, they would have assumed the worst. Maybe they would have fired back. No one knows. V. Petrov did not tell anyone what happened, not right away. he filed a report, a bureaucratic, technical report about a system malfunction. His superiors were not pleased. The system had failed, and that reflected poorly on everyone involved. There were questions about why he hadn't reported it, why he'd waited, why he doubted. He was not punished, exactly, but he was not rewarded. His career stalled. He was reassigned. The Soviet military was not interested in officers who questioned protocol, even when questioning protocol turned out to be correct. He continued working, quietly, unnoticed. He retired a few years later. He lived in a small apartment. His wife passed away. He lived on a pension that barely covered his expenses. For years, almost no one outside a small circle of military personnel knew what he'd done. The story eventually came out, slowly, through interviews, through researchers piecing together the records. By the time it became public, the Soviet Union had collapsed. The Cold War was over. The satellites and bunkers and missile silos were still there. But the urgent fear, the sense that the world might end at any moment, had faded. Petrov gave interviews sometimes. He did not enjoy them. He did not think of himself as a hero. He bristled when people called him that. He said he was just doing his job, that anyone in his position would have done the same, that he'd simply used his training and his judgment. But that wasn't quite true. Anyone in his position was supposed to report the launch. That was the protocol. That was the job. He'd chosen not to. 6. There's a question that doesn't get asked enough. How many times has this almost happened? We know about Petrov because it was documented, because he talked about it later, because researchers found the records. But how many other moments like this were there? How many other people in other bunkers, at other consoles, faced with other alarms, made similar decisions? There was another incident in 1979 when an American early warning system detected a massive Soviet launch. It turned out someone had loaded a training simulation into the system by mistake. The machines were showing a war that wasn't happening. Officers scrambled, planes launched, and then someone figured it out, stopped it. In 1980, a faulty computer chip worth 46 cents caused American systems to show 200 Soviet missiles incoming. Again, officers hesitated. Again, someone questioned the data. Again, it was a false alarm. These stories are known because they'd have been declassified. But the systems ran for decades. Thousands of people cycled through these positions. How many other glitches were there? How many other moments where someone had to decide whether to trust the machine? And how many times did someone choose correctly without ever being recognized? Without anyone ever knowing their name? The structure of these systems, both Soviet and American, was designed around the assumption that humans would act like machines, that they would see the data, follow the protocol, report what they saw. Speed was the priority. Certainty was assumed. The entire doctrine of mutually assured destruction relied on this, that both sides would respond automatically to an attack, creating the deterrent. But that assumption required something impossible: perfect information. And information was never perfect. The machines had errors. The humans operating them had doubts. And in the gap between what the machines said and what the humans believed, decisions had to be made. Decisions like Petrov's. Says him. He lived another 34 years after that night. He died in 2017 in his apartment near Moscow at the age of 77. The world learned of his death months later. There was no state funeral. no moment of silence. Most people had never heard of him. Those who did know called him the man who saved the world. He rejected the phrase. He said he'd just been doing his job, that he didn't save anything. He'd simply not reported something he didn't believe was real. But that distinction matters. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He didn't run into a burning building or throw himself on a grenade. He didn't act. He chose not to act. In a system designed to prioritize action, he chose stillness. In a moment designed for certainty, he chose doubt. And that doubt, quiet, unwitnessed, unrecorded except in a single report filed in a Soviet military archive, might have been the most important decision anyone made that year, or any year. The historians will debate it. They'll say we can't know for sure what would have happened if he'd reported the launch. They'll say maybe the generals would have questioned it. Maybe the Americans would have shown restraint. Maybe the systems and safeguards would have worked. Maybe, but maybe not. And that's the uncomfortable truth. We live in a world where maybe not was a real possibility, where the end of civilization was 5 missiles away, 5 false missiles, reflected sunlight, a glitch in a satellite, and the only thing standing between that glitch and catastrophe was one person's decision to wait, not to trust the machine, not to follow the protocol, just to wait. Wait, Petrov was asked once in an interview years later if he thought about that night. If it stayed with him, he said it did. That he'd gone over it many times, that he'd questioned himself, that he still didn't know, not with absolute certainty, if he'd made the right choice. He knew the outcome. He knew the missiles weren't real. But in the moment, he didn't know. He'd made a guess, an educated guess based on training and intuition, and a deep skepticism of the system he'd helped to build. But still a guess. And he'd lived with that knowledge for the rest of his life. That he'd guessed, and that the guess had been right, but that it could have been wrong. That's not the narrative we prefer. We prefer heroes who are certain, who act decisively, who know in the moment that they're doing the right thing. But that's not what happened. What happened was a tired man covering someone else's shift, staring at a screen that told him the world was ending, and choosing against protocol, against training, against the structure of the system he was part of, to believe it wasn't. And then waiting, sitting in that chair, with the alarm still sounding, with the eyes of the other officers on him, with the weight of the decision pressing down, and just waiting. Waiting to see if he was right. Ein. We don't build monuments to doubt. We build them to action, to decisive moments, to people who charge forward, who made the hard choice, who sacrificed themselves for others. But sometimes the hard choice is not to act. Sometimes the sacrifice is to accept the responsibility of inaction, to live with the uncertainty, to sit with the possibility that you might be wrong, and the consequences of being wrong might be unthinkable. Petrov didn't save the world in a moment of heroic clarity. He saved it, if he saved it, by being uncertain, by questioning, by choosing in a system that demanded certainty to admit he didn't know. There's no dramatic lesson here, no moral that ties everything together, no call to be more like Petrov, because the truth is, most of us will never face a decision like that. Most of us will never sit in a bunker with the fate of millions, depending on whether we pick up a phone. But we live in the world his decision created. Or at least, we live in one version of it. The version where the missiles weren't real, where the alarm was false, where someone chose to wait instead of react. There are other versions where he reported it, versions where someone else was sitting in that chair, versions where the protocols were followed. Those versions don't exist, but they could have. They were possible. They were close. And that proximity, that nearness to the edge, is what lingers. X. The bunker at Serpukhov 15 still exists. The system has been updated, modernized, replaced. Different satellites, different sensors, different protocols, different people, the same job. To watch the sky, to wait for the signal that means the world is ending, to report what the machines tell them. And somewhere in bunkers and control rooms and command centers around the world, people are still sitting at consoles, still watching screens, still waiting for the alarm that might be real or might not be. They've been trained. They know the protocols. They understand the systems, but they're also human. And if the alarm sounds, they'll have to decide, do they trust the machine or do they trust themselves? Do they act or do they wait? Petrov chose to wait. He chose doubt over certainty. He chose stillness over action. And in that choice, in that moment of hesitation, in that decision not to decide, something didn't happen. The world didn't end, not that night, not yet. The rest is silence.